The school hall was alive with excitement. It was the charity auction, and everyone wanted to impress. Adais stood quietly in a corner, her plain cloth and neatly done simple hairstyle making her stick out like a sore thumb among the fancy dresses and shiny shoes. She clutched her notebook tightly, wishing she could disappear. Then it happened. "Stop her! She's a thief!" Chiamaka's voice cut through the noise like thunder. All eyes turned to her. She stood in the center of the hall, her perfectly styled hair glowing under the lights. The queen bee of the school had spoken, and no one dared question her. "She stole my bracelet!" Chiamaka cried, pointing an accusing finger at Adais. Adais's heart dropped. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice shaking. Principal Ezi walked over with a deep frown. "Adaisi, open your bag." "I didn't." "Open it now," Chiamaka snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. Adaisi's hands trembled as she unzipped her school bag. The room fell silent as Principal Ezi rummaged through the bag. Then the bracelet tumbled out, landing with a soft clink. Gasps erupted. Chiamaka smirked, crossing her arms. "I told you." Adaisi's legs felt weak. "I don't know how it got there," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Principal Easy's voice was cold. "Come with me, Adais. We need to discuss this in my office." As she followed him, whispers filled the air. Adais felt small as she watched Chiamaka Okeki sweep through the wide hall of Nduka Academy like she owned it. And in a way, she did. The elite school was for students who came from the most powerful families in the city. Politicians, CEOs, celebrities. This was their world, and Chiamaka had been born to rule it. Her father, Chief Obi Okeki, was one of the wealthiest men in the country. His donations had built the school's sprawling sports complex, its state-of-the-art science labs, and even the gleaming library where students studied beneath crystal chandeliers. Everyone at Nduka knew the Okeki name. But behind the grand mansion and designer clothes, Chiamaka's life wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Her father was rarely home, always chasing his next big business deal. Her mother, Uchechi, spent her days hosting charity galas and lecturing Chiamaka about their family's legacy. "You must never let anyone disrespect the Okeki name," Uchechi said one evening as she adjusted her gold bracelet. "We are better than the rest. Never forget that." Chiamaka had learned to hide the loneliness that came with her father's absence and her mother's expectations. Instead, she buried it under a layer of sharp smiles and cold words. If she couldn't control her family life, she would control her world at school. And anyone who stepped out of line, like Adase, would pay the price. Adase remembers the day she walked into Nduka Academy with hope in her heart. She clutched her backpack tightly as she stepped onto the glossy floors, her reflection staring back at her from the polished tiles. She knew she didn't belong here, not in the way the others did, but she had earned her spot. The scholarship had been her ticket. Nduka Academy had partnered with a foundation to allow brilliant students from less privileged backgrounds to study alongside the wealthy elite. Adise had worked hard, her nights spent studying, her mind solving problems faster than her pencil could write. Her mother had cried when the acceptance letter arrived. "My Adise," she said, wiping her tears, "you're going to make us so proud." She hugged her tightly, her voice steady but firm. "Remember to work hard, respect others, and never forget your worth." Adise nodded, carrying her mother's words with her. But there was something else she carried, something no one else knew. She was part of a secret group, a circle of individuals gifted with supernatural power that they can bend reality itself to their will. Being part of the group, however, had taught her discipline and control, showing her how to use her gift responsibly. "Our power is for protection and helping others in need," their leader Inkiru often said. "Never for revenge, never for anger." These lessons became Adaise's mantra, words she held onto tightly. Standing in the grand halls of Nduka Academy, Adaise repeated those words in her mind like a prayer. She had entered a new world and she didn't know what awaited her, but she promised herself one thing: she would work hard and succeed. She just hadn't known someone like Chiamaka would be waiting. When she got to Principal Easy's office, Adaise sat stiffly, her hands clutching her lap. Her eyes were red, but she refused to let the tears fall. Across from her, Principal Easy stared at her with disappointment. "Do you know how serious this is, Adaize?" he said, his voice heavy. "I didn't take it," Adaize said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, pleading, "I don't know how it got in my bag." Principal Isa sighed, rubbing his forehead. "The evidence is clear. That bracelet was in your possession." Adaize's lips trembled, but she stayed silent. Arguing wouldn't help. She knew the truth, but in this school, the truth didn't matter. When Principal Ease dismissed her, Adaize walked out of the office with her head down. In the hallway, she heard muffled giggles and whispers. Her face burned with shame. She knew they were laughing at her. Then she saw Chiamaka standing nearby, surrounded by her friends. Chiamaka tossed her perfect hair and smiled like she'd won a prize. "Poor Adaize," Chiamaka said loudly, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I guess when you're that poor, stealing is the only way to get nice things." Laughter erupted from her group. Adaize clenched her fists. A strange energy flickered in her chest. She took a deep breath and walked away. That night, as Adaize lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about her place in the school. She had earned her spot, but now it felt like she didn't belong. Still, she promised herself one thing: she would endure, no matter what. The next day, Adaize sat alone under the big mango tree at the edge of the school courtyard. Her notebook rested on her knees, but she couldn't focus. The whispers in the hallways and the cold stares from her classmates followed her everywhere. She felt like the whole school had decided she was guilty. She didn't even notice Chiamaka until her shadow loomed over her. Adaize looked up. Chiamaka stood there with her group of friends, the same smug smile plastered on her face. She was the queen bee, untouchable and adored by everyone. "Still writing your silly little notes?" Chiamaka asked, crossing her arms. "What's the point? No matter what you write, it won't make you any less poor." Adaize's chest tightened. She forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want, Chiamaka?" "I just wanted to see how you're holding up after your little mistake," Chiamaka said sweetly, though her eyes were cold. Her friends snickered behind her. "I didn't steal anything," Adaize said firmly, her voice steady. "Oh, please," Chiamaka said, rolling her eyes. "Everyone knows you don't belong here. You should just pack your things and go back to wherever it is you came from." Adaize's fingers gripped her notebook. The flicker of energy inside her chest burned brighter, a quiet reminder of the power she held, power strong enough to destroy Chiamaka in an instant. But she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't let Chiamaka win. Not like this. Chiamaka smirked and turned away, leading her group back toward the school building. Adaize stared after her, her heart pounding. Later that day, Adaize sat at her desk in the back of the classroom, her head low as the teacher droned on about geometric shapes. She tried to focus on the math problems in front of her, but the whispers from her classmates made it impossible. "She's so quiet, like she's scared," someone whispered. "I heard she stole something at the charity event," another murmured. Adaize bit her lip and gripped her pencil tightly. It felt like every eye in the room was on her, judging her, mocking her. The bracelet incident had spread through the school like wildfire, and no one seemed to care whether she was innocent. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, she hurriedly gathered her books and slipped out the door. She wanted to be invisible, to disappear before anyone could say anything more. But as she passed the principal's office, she heard voices that made her stop. "Chiamaka's father is a huge asset to this school," said Principal Ease, his tone firm. "Without his donations, we wouldn't have the new library, the sports field, everything we need to stay competitive." A teacher responded in a low voice. "But her behavior, let it go," the principal interrupted. "It's not worth risking everything." Adaize stepped back, her heart sinking. She hadn't expected Principal Ease to be her champion, but hearing this was like a punch to the gut. By lunchtime, she sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at her food. Across the room, Chiamaka laughed loudly with her friends, basking in the attention. Adaize clenched her fists under the table. The flicker of energy stirred again, stronger now, but she forced it down. Life in the school settled back to the regular pace after the necklace incident. The school science fair was only a week away, and that is what everyone is talking about now. Adais, like other students, had been pouring her heart into her project. It wasn't just about the competition, it was her chance to prove herself. She had spent nights sketching diagrams and gathering materials, determined to show everyone that she belonged here, no matter what they thought. In the quiet of the library after school, Adais put the finishing touches on her display board. She stepped back and smiled. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of pride. But the peace didn't last. As Adais left the library, Chiamaka and her friends appeared in the hallway blocking her path. Chiamaka's smile was sharp and dangerous. "Still playing the perfect little scholar, I see," she said. Adais sighed, clutching her project tightly. "I don't have time for this, Chiamaka." "Oh, you'll make time," Chiamaka said, stepping closer. She reached for Adai's display board. "Don't!" Adais shouted, her voice trembling. But it was too late. Chiamaka snatched the board and held it up for her friends to see. "What is this? A kindergarten art project?" Chiamaka sneered. Her friends laughed as she tilted the board, letting some of the carefully placed pieces fall to the floor. Adais's chest tightened as her hard work crumpled in Chiamaka's hands. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Because you don't belong here," Chiamaka said coldly, letting the board slip from her fingers. It crashed to the ground, the carefully glued pieces scattering across the floor. Adais gasped, dropping to her knees. Her hands shook as she tried to gather the fragments of her work. The diagrams she had spent hours perfecting were torn, the centerpiece broken into jagged pieces. As Adisi gathered the pieces with shaking hands, she bit her lip hard to stop the tears from spilling. As the sound of Chiamaka's laughter faded, she made a silent promise to herself. One day, this would end. At home that evening, Chiamaka slammed the door to her room, tossing her expensive school bag onto the plush pink chair in the corner. She stared at the neatly arranged shelves and expensive decorations, but none of it felt comforting. Her perfect life was starting to feel more like a cage. She threw herself onto her bed and pulled out her phone. Scrolling through her messages, she smiled at the flood of praise from her friends. "You're hilarious, Chiamaka," one said. "That science fair thing was epic," said another. But her smile faded when she saw the time. Her father was supposed to be home by now. "Daddy's flight was delayed," her mother's voice echoed in her mind from earlier that day. "He'll be back in a week." Chiamaka clenched her jaw. It was always the same excuse. A week, a month. It didn't matter. He was never around when she needed him. Her mother, Uchechi, spent all her time organizing charity events and telling Chiamaka how to act like a proper Okeki woman. But no one asked her what she wanted. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she thought about Adais. The look on her face when the science project fell apart. Chiamaka's lips curled into a bitter smile. At least she had control over someone, even if everything else in her life felt so out of reach. Her mother called from downstairs. "Chiamaka, dinner's ready." With a sigh, Chiamaka shoved her phone away and left her room, pushing her feelings deep inside. The next morning, Adaisi sat alone under a tree in the school compound, her notebook balanced on her laps. She stared at the words she had written but couldn't focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the crumpled pieces of her science project. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey, Adais." Adais looked up to see Ifunanya, one of her classmates who is also a scholarship student, standing a few feet away. She held a hesitant smile, her hands tucked nervously into her jacket pockets. "Mind if I sit?" Ifunanya asked. Adaisi shrugged. "Sure." Ifunanya sat down carefully, smoothing out her skirt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ifunanya said, "What happened yesterday? It wasn't fair." Adaisi blinked. "You saw. If I said anything, Chiamaka would make my life miserable too," Ifunanya admitted, looking down at her hands. "But I just wanted you to know not everyone thinks you're a thief or doesn't care." Adais felt her chest tighten, this time with a strange warmth. It wasn't much, but hearing those words meant more than she could say. "Thanks," she said quietly. Ifunanya offered a small smile. If you ever need help, let me know. But before Adaiz could respond, laughter echoed from the courtyard. Both girls turned to see Chiamaka and her group strolling toward them. Ifunanya's face paled. I should go, she said quickly, standing and rushing off without another word. Adaize watched her leave, the moment of comfort disappearing like a puff of smoke. She sighed and turned back to her notebook, gripping her pen tightly. Chiamaka always found a way to ruin everything. That night, Adaize lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. The memory of Chiamaka dropping her project flashed through her thoughts again, and the humiliation clawed at her chest. When sleep finally came, it brought more than rest. In her dream, Adaize found herself in a vast, endless space filled with soft golden light. The air hummed with energy, familiar and comforting. She recognized this place. This was where the group met, beyond the physical world, where their shared connection brought them together. The other members appeared around her one by one, their forms shimmering with the same glow as the space around them. They stood in a circle, their faces both concerned and curious. Adaize, Onyinye said, stepping forward. Her voice carried a weight that made the air still. What happened to you? Adaize hesitated, her hands clenching at her sides. Nothing I can't handle, she said, though her voice wavered slightly. It doesn't look that way, Akene said, his gaze sharp. We've felt your anger. It's loud, Adaize. What happened? She humiliated her, Nkiru said, her tone bitter. That girl, Chiamaka, she needs to pay. No, Adaize said firmly, lifting her head. That's not what our power is for. You all know that. She'll keep doing it, Akene argued. She doesn't deserve your mercy. It's not mercy, Adaize replied, her voice calm but resolute. It's discipline. This power isn't ours to use however we want. It's meant to protect, to heal, to guide, not to destroy. The group fell silent, though Adaize could feel the tension hanging in the air. Finally, Onyinye gave a slow nod. You're right, but be careful, Adaize. Even discipline has its limits. As the golden light around her began to fade, Adaize felt a warmth in her chest, not the sharp, angry heat from earlier, but something steadier. When she woke, the morning sun was streaming through her window. She sat up slowly, repeating the words she'd spoken in the dream. This power isn't for revenge, she whispered to herself. Not for anger. But even as she said it, she wondered how much longer she could hold that truth close. The next morning, Adaize walked into school with a firm plan. She would stay out of Chiamaka's way, avoid her friends, and focus on rebuilding her science project. It was the only way to move forward, but life at the school wasn't that simple. As Adaize entered the classroom, she noticed Chiamaka's group sitting at the back, whispering and giggling. Their laughter felt like needles in Adaize's back, but she kept her head down and took her seat. The teacher entered and clapped her hands. Good morning, everyone. Today we'll start working in pairs on our group project. I've already assigned your partners. Adaize felt her chest tighten as the teacher began calling out names. When she heard hers, she froze. Adaize, you'll be with Chiamaka, the teacher said, smiling as if she'd done Adaize a favor. The room filled with murmurs and sneaky glances. Chiamaka's smirk widened as she leaned back in her chair. Lucky me, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Adaize felt her stomach churn. This can't be happening, she thought. When the teacher dismissed them to work in pairs, Chiamaka strolled over, her arms crossed. So scholarship girl, she said, her voice dripping with mockery. What's your big plan for this project? Oh wait, you're not planning to steal my ideas, are you? Adaize clenched her jaw but didn't respond. She focused on the page in front of her, trying to ignore the heat rising in her chest. Silent, huh? Chiamaka leaned closer, her voice low but venomous. I'll make sure everyone knows you don't belong in this school by the time we're done. Adaize said nothing, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't over. Adaize spent the next few days trying to work on the group project with Chiamaka, but it was impossible. Every meeting turned into a performance for Chiamaka. She made loud comments, rolling her eyes as if Adaizi's ideas were ridiculous. "You don't seriously think that's going to work, do you?" Chiamaka said during one session, tossing Adaizi's notes aside. "Honestly, I should just do this whole project myself." Adaizi stayed silent, swallowing her frustration. She needed a good grade, and she couldn't afford to let Chiamaka's games ruin her focus. The day of their presentation finally arrived. Adaizi had spent hours preparing her portion of the work, and despite Chiamaka's interference, she felt ready. She took a deep breath as they stood at the front of the class, but then Chiamaka struck. As Adaizi began speaking, Chiamaka interrupted. "Actually," she said, smiling sweetly at the class, "I did most of the work. Adaizi didn't really contribute much." The room filled with whispers and muffled laughter. Adaizi's heart pounded. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. Chiamaka held up a sheet of paper. "These are her notes," she said, waving it for everyone to see. "Messy and useless. I had to rewrite everything." Adaizi's cheeks burned. She stared at the paper, realizing it wasn't even her handwriting. Chiamaka had forged it. When the teacher said nothing, Adaizi felt the familiar weight of injustice settle over her. She clenched her fists, holding back tears as Chiamaka basked in the attention. Adaizi barely remembered how she made it through the rest of the school day. The humiliation of the group presentation clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. The quiet stares and whispered conversations in the hallways burned, each one a reminder that Chiamaka had won again. By the time the final bell rang, Adaizi had only one thought: escape. She hurried to the library, hoping for solitude, but as she stepped inside, her stomach dropped. Chiamaka was there, surrounded by her friends, her posture as confident as ever. In her hands was something that made Adaizi's heart stop, her notebook. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that notebook. It was her sanctuary, her private world, where she poured her thoughts and ideas, where she found solace when everything else felt overwhelming. "How did you—" Adaizi started, her voice catching in her throat. "Oh, this," Chiamaka said, waving the notebook lazily. "I found it lying around. You really should take better care of your things, scholarship girl." Adaizi's face burned. "Give it back," she said, her voice trembling. "Or what?" Chiamaka replied, smirking as she opened the notebook. Her friends leaned in, giggling. "Let's see what we have here," Chiamaka continued, flipping through the pages. "Wow, look at this. Sometimes I feel like no one sees me for who I really am." "How sad." She laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Adaizi took a step forward. "Give it back, Chiamaka," she said again, her voice firmer now. "Or what?" Chiamaka said, holding the notebook just out of reach. "What are you going to do, Adaizi? Write something else pathetic? Or maybe I'll just keep this—" Adaizi didn't let her finish. She snatched the notebook from Chiamaka's hands, her fingers gripping it tightly. For a moment, their eyes locked. "You've crossed the line," Adaizi said, her voice steady but sharp. "This is the last straw." Her words cut through the silence, and for the first time Chiamaka didn't smirk. Adaizi's gaze didn't waver, and the weight of her words lingered long after the words had been spoken. Chiamaka was unable to say a word. There was something in Adaizi's eyes that she couldn't quite place, something sharp, unyielding. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was resolve.